June 24, 1941. A single Soviet tank sat in the middle of a narrow road outside Raseiniai, Lithuania. Behind it, an entire German panzer division ground to a halt. Not because they were afraid, because they had no choice. The beast blocking their path was something they'd never seen before, something their intelligence had told them didn't exist. The KV-1 heavy tank, 52 tons of Soviet engineering that was about to shatter everything the Wehrmacht thought they knew about armored warfare. Lieutenant Hans Weber pressed his eye against the gunner's scope of his Panzer III. The massive silhouette ahead hadn't moved in 20 minutes. His commander, Captain Friedrich Steiner, stood in the turret hatch, binoculars raised, studying the motionless tank with the kind of intensity reserved for things that shouldn't be possible. Behind them, the entire 6th Panzer Division sat idle. Trucks, half-tracks, supply vehicles, infantry, all stopped, all waiting. Because one Soviet tank had decided that this particular stretch of Lithuanian countryside belonged to Russia, and Germany could go to hell. The invasion of the Soviet Union was 3 days old. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand gambit to crush Stalin's empire before winter, was supposed to be a lightning campaign. The German war machine had rolled through Poland in weeks, conquered France in 40 days. The Soviets, everyone said, would collapse even faster. Their leadership was decimated by Stalin's purges. Their equipment was outdated, their tactics were rigid and predictable. On paper, the Red Army was already beaten. On paper. But the KV-1 wasn't supposed to exist. German intelligence had photographs of Soviet T-26 and BT tanks, light vehicles with thin armor and small guns. They had reports of the T-34, a medium tank that worried some of the more cautious planners, but nothing the Wehrmacht couldn't handle. Nobody mentioned a 52-ton monster with armor thick enough to bounce 50mm shells like raindrops. Nobody warned them about the 76mm gun that could punch through German armor at ranges the panzers couldn't even dream of reaching. Weber fired. The 50mm shell struck the KV-1's frontal armor with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The tank didn't move, didn't even rock on its suspension. The shell ricocheted off into the tree line, leaving nothing but a bright scar on the Soviet armor. Steiner lowered his binoculars. His jaw was set in that peculiar way it got when the world stopped making sense. He'd seen German 88mm anti-aircraft guns destroy French heavy tanks in minutes. He'd watched panzer units carve through Polish armor like it was made of paper. But this thing sitting in the middle of the road, absorbing direct hits like they were insults? The KV-1's turret began to turn, slowly, deliberately. The kind of movement that said the crew inside knew exactly what they were doing and weren't particularly worried about the outcome. Weber felt his throat go dry. The 70mm gun was tracking toward them now, the massive barrel swinging with mechanical precision. Steiner shouted something, but Weber was already moving, dropping into the driver's compartment, screaming at Klaus to reverse, to get them off this road, to move. Damn it, move! The KV-1 fired. The sound was deeper than any tank gun Weber had heard, a bass note that rattled his teeth. The shell passed so close to their turret that he felt the displacement wave, a rush of pressure that made his ears pop. Behind them, a Panzer IV exploded. Just exploded. One moment it was there, the next it was fire and twisted metal, and the screams of men who'd never see Berlin again. Klaus had the engine howling, backing them off the road into the ditch, trying to put anything between them and that gun. Trees, terrain, hope. The KV-1 sat there, unmoving, like it had all the time in the world. Colonel Ernst Hoffmann arrived at the roadblock 30 minutes later. He'd commanded armored units since Poland, had earned his Knight's Cross in France, and considered himself a reasonable expert on how tank battles were supposed to work. This wasn't that. This was a nightmare, dressed up in Soviet green paint. His recon units reported the same story from 3 different angles. One tank, heavily damaged, probably immobilized, definitely out of ammunition by now. But it wouldn't die, and more importantly, it wouldn't move. Behind the KV-1, the road stretched back toward the Soviet lines. In front of it, the entire weight of the 6th Panzer Division sat paralyzed. Supply columns that needed to push forward to support the advance. Infantry units that were supposed to be securing the flanks. Artillery batteries that couldn't set up because the road was blocked. One tank was doing what an entire Soviet division couldn't manage. It was stopping the Blitzkrieg Cold. Hoffmann ordered up the 88s. The 80mm anti-aircraft gun was Germany's answer to problems that conventional tanks couldn't solve. High velocity, flat trajectory, enough punch to knock down bombers at altitude. If anything could kill the KV-1, it was the 88. They brought up 2 guns under cover of smoke, positioning them in a tree line with clean sight lines to the Soviet tank. The crews worked fast, professional, the kind of efficiency that came from training and experience. The first gun fired at 800 meters, direct hit to the turret. The KV-1 shuddered, the shell penetrated. Finally, the turret hatch opened. A Soviet tanker emerged, his uniform scorched, face blackened with smoke and cordite residue. He climbed down from the tank slowly, like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 days. Behind him, another crewman, then a third. They stood beside their broken vehicle, hands raised, looking at the massed German forces surrounding them with expressions that weren't quite surrender. More like exhaustion. The kind that came from holding a position you knew you'd never leave alive, and being surprised when you did. The Germans moved in carefully, weapons ready, expecting a trap or a suicide charge or something that made sense in the context of war. What they found was a tank that shouldn't have been there. The armor was scarred with dozens of impact marks, evidence of shells that had hit and failed. The tracks were damaged, probably from a mine or a direct hit that had finally immobilized it. Inside, the crew compartment was a hell of cordite smoke, spent shell casings, and the metallic smell of overheated machinery. The radio was destroyed. The ammunition racks were empty. The men had fought until they had nothing left to fight with, and then they'd kept fighting anyway. Hoffman walked around the KV-1 with a mixture of professional respect and genuine dread. This wasn't just a good tank. This was a revolution in armored warfare. The Germans had built the panzer divisions on speed and coordination, using lighter tanks with decent guns to outmaneuver and overwhelm opposition. The doctrine worked because everyone else was playing the same game. But the Soviets weren't playing. They'd built something that rewrote the rules. Thick armor, big gun, the kind of vehicle that could sit in one spot and force an entire division to deal with it on its terms. The crew was interrogated, though that word made it sound more dramatic than it was. The Soviets were too tired to be defiant, too wrung out to play games. Yes, there were more KV-1s. No, they weren't rare. The Red Army had hundreds of them, thousands maybe. And they had another tank, the T-34, that was faster and almost as well protected. The Germans had been told the Soviets were backwards, technologically inferior, relying on numbers instead of quality. The men standing beside the wrecked KV-1 suggested that someone had been catastrophically wrong. Word spread through the 6th Panzer Division like a virus. The invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped by a single Soviet tank crewed by 5 men who refused to die. Morale didn't collapse, but something shifted. The easy confidence that had carried them through Poland and France developed cracks. If one immobilized tank could hold them up for hours, what would happen when they faced Soviet armor in force, with fuel and ammunition and room to maneuver? The question hung in the air like smoke from burning vehicles. The KV-1 wasn't an anomaly. As the German advance pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they encountered more of them, along with the T-34s that intelligence had dismissed as propaganda. The Panzer IIIs and IVs that had dominated European battlefields suddenly found themselves outclassed, outgunned, and out of their depth. German tankers developed a healthy respect for Soviet armor, the kind that kept you alive by making you cautious. The 80 mm became standard equipment for dealing with heavy Soviet tanks, and even then, it was a gamble. The Soviets built their vehicles to take punishment and keep fighting. Lieutenant Weber survived Raseiniai. Survived the entire Russian campaign, actually, though that word felt increasingly inadequate for what it meant to live through the Eastern Front. He never forgot the KV-1, the way it had sat there absorbing everything they threw at it, patient and implacable. Years later, after the war, after the trials and the reconstruction, and the slow process of trying to become human again, he'd tell people that the moment Germany lost World War II wasn't Stalingrad or Normandy. It was June 24, 1941, on a narrow Lithuanian road, when a Soviet tank refused to die and showed the Wehrmacht that they'd invaded a country that knew how to fight back. The KV-1 that stopped the 6th Panzer Division was eventually hauled away by German recovery crews, studied, measured, and stripped for intelligence. The data went back to Berlin, where engineers and designers pored over every detail, trying to understand how the Soviets had built something so effective. The result was a cascade of German heavy tank programs: the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, vehicles designed to counter the threat that Soviet armor represented. Germany spent the rest of the war trying to catch up to a standard the Soviets had achieved before Barbarossa even began. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Soviet tankers who crewed the KV-1 at Raseiniai became legends in their own right, though legends is a complicated word when applied to the Red Army. Stalin's regime didn't celebrate individuals, it celebrated the collective, the Soviet people as a unified force. But soldiers remembered. The story spread through the ranks, picked up embellishments and details that may or may not have been true, but the core remained constant. 5 men in a single tank had held off an entire German division. They'd fought until they ran out of ammunition, until their vehicle was immobilized, until continuing meant certain death. And then they'd surrendered because there was literally nothing left to do. The Germans treated them well, all things considered. POW camps on the Eastern Front were nightmares, but these men had earned a measure of respect that transcended ideology. They'd fought professionally, bravely, without the kind of fanaticism that made surrender impossible. Hoffman made sure they were processed correctly, that their status as prisoners was documented, that they weren't just shot and buried in an unmarked grave. It was a small mercy in a war that had precious few, but it mattered. The KV-1 itself was a product of Soviet design philosophy that Western observers consistently misunderstood. American and British engineers built tanks with crew comfort in mind, with ergonomics and reliability as key factors. German designers balanced firepower, armor, and mobility, trying to create the perfect synthesis. The Soviets? They built tanks to win wars. Crew comfort was irrelevant if the armor was thick enough to keep them alive. Reliability mattered less than production numbers. A KV-1 was uncomfortable, mechanically finicky, and required constant maintenance. It was also nearly indestructible in combat, and the Red Army could build them faster than the Germans could destroy them. The design came from the Kirov plant in Leningrad, named after Sergei Kirov, the Soviet official whose assassination in 1934 had given Stalin the excuse he needed to launch the Great Purge. The irony wasn't lost on the engineers who worked there. They designed weapons for a regime that had murdered thousands of their colleagues on suspicion of disloyalty. But they were also patriots who understood that Germany was coming, that Hitler viewed Slavs as subhuman, that the Wehrmacht would show no mercy to the Soviet Union. So they built the best tanks they could, knowing those tanks might be the only thing standing between their families and annihilation. The KV-1 entered service in 1939, just in time for the Winter War against Finland. The Finns, outnumbered and outgunned, had fought the Red Army to a standstill, using superior tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Soviet armor, mostly light tanks and outdated designs, had been vulnerable to Finnish anti-tank weapons and Molotov cocktails. The KV-1 changed that equation. Finnish guns couldn't penetrate its armor. Molotov cocktails were useless against a tank that could button up and keep fighting. The Soviets won the Winter War, though at a cost that shocked the world and convinced Hitler that the Red Army was ripe for destruction. Hitler was wrong. He'd misread the lessons of the Winter War, seeing Soviet casualties as evidence of incompetence rather than a willingness to absorb punishment in pursuit of victory. The Red Army learned from Finland, adapted, improved. By the time Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, the Soviets had reorganized their armor units, improved their tactics, and produced thousands of KV-1s and T-34s. The Germans were expecting to fight the Red Army of 1939. They got the Red Army of 1941 instead, and the difference was measured in burning panzers and stalled offensives. The psychological impact of the KV-1 on German troops was significant. Tankers who'd felt invincible in Poland and France suddenly found themselves vulnerable, outmatched by Soviet vehicles that could kill them from ranges they couldn't return fire from. Infantry learned to fear the sound of a KV-1's engine, the deep rumble that announced the arrival of something their Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons might not stop. The confidence that had driven the Blitzkrieg evaporated in the face of Soviet armor, replaced by a grim determination to survive. German responses evolved. The 80 mm became standard for anti-tank work, despite being heavy and difficult to move. Tactics shifted to emphasize ambushes and close-range engagements where German guns could target weaker side and rear armor. Engineers developed new weapons, like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, infantry portable anti-tank rockets that could damage or destroy even heavy Soviet armor. But these were reactions, stopgap measures to deal with a threat that shouldn't have existed. Germany was playing catch-up in a war where technological superiority was supposed to be their trump card. The production numbers told their own story. Germany built approximately 1,850 Tiger tanks during the entire war, each one a masterpiece of engineering that required thousands of man-hours and specialized materials. The Soviet Union produced over 5,200 KV-1s, and that wasn't counting the 84,000 T-34s that rolled off assembly lines in factories across Russia. When the Germans bombed a Soviet tank plant, the Soviets moved it. Literally. They disassembled entire factories, loaded them onto trains, and rebuilt them beyond the Urals, out of reach of German bombers. Production barely slowed. The Soviet war machine absorbed damage that would have crippled any other nation and kept building tanks. The crews who fought in KV-1s had their own perspective on the vehicle. It was a beast to maintain, prone to transmission failures and track problems. The interior was cramped, hot in summer and freezing in winter. The visibility was poor, the ergonomics were terrible, and the ammunition stowage was positioned in ways that made reloading under fire a nightmare. But it kept them alive. When German shells bounced off the armor, when 80mm rounds penetrated but failed to kill everyone inside, when they could sit in one position and hold off an entire German assault, the discomfort didn't matter. The KV-1 was a fortress on tracks, and fortresses saved lives. Soviet tankers developed a dark humor about their vehicles. The KV-1 was called the Klim Voroshilov, named after the Soviet defense minister who'd overseen its development. Voroshilov was a Stalin loyalist, a political survivor who'd managed to avoid the purges that had claimed so many of his colleagues. The tankers joke that the KV-1 was like Voroshilov himself, slow, heavy, hard to kill, and absolutely ruthless when it needed to be. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it was accurate. The German engineers who studied captured KV-1s came away with mixed feelings. The Soviet design was crude in many ways, lacking the precision and attention to detail that characterized German engineering. But it was also brilliant in its simplicity. Thick armor, big gun, reliable enough to work in the field with minimal maintenance. The Soviets had built a tank that could be produced in quantity, operated by crews with minimal training, and still be effective against the best Germany had to offer. It was the kind of design philosophy that won wars, even if it didn't win awards for elegance. The influence of the KV-1 on German tank design was profound. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, borrowed heavily from the T-34's sloped armor design, but incorporated German engineering precision. The Tiger, with its 80mm gun and heavy armor, was a direct response to the KV-1 threat. The King Tiger took things even further, creating a vehicle that was nearly invincible in combat, but so heavy and mechanically unreliable that it spent more time being repaired than fighting. Germany was building better tanks, but they couldn't build them fast enough, and that was the real lesson of the KV-1. Quality mattered, but quantity had a quality all its own. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. By 1942, the KV-1 was starting to show its age. The Germans had adapted, bringing up heavier weapons and developing tactics specifically designed to counter Soviet heavy armor. The KV-1's 76mm gun, formidable in 1941, was adequate but not overwhelming against the improved German tanks entering service. The Soviets responded with the KV-85, mounting an 85mm gun in an enlarged turret, but the design was reaching the limits of its chassis. The IS-2, which began replacing the KV series in 1943, took the lessons learned from the KV-1 and applied them to a more modern, more powerful platform. But the KV-1's legacy endured. It had bought the Soviet Union time, when time was the most valuable commodity in the world. In the desperate summer of 1941, when the Wehrmacht was racing toward Moscow and Leningrad, when Stalin's regime teetered on the edge of collapse, the KV-1 and T-34 had slowed the German advance just enough. They hadn't stopped Barbarossa, but they'd blunted it, turned a lightning campaign into a grinding war of attrition. And in a war of attrition against the Soviet Union, Germany was always going to lose. The tankers who'd fought in KV-1s and survived the war came home to a Soviet Union that had been devastated beyond comprehension. 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war, military and civilian. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Factories that had produced tanks were now producing prefabricated housing for refugees. The victory parades in Moscow were triumphant, celebratory, but they couldn't hide the cost. The Soviet Union had won, but it had paid for victory with blood and suffering on a scale that defied description. Veterans didn't talk much about their experiences, not publicly. Stalin's regime was paranoid about anyone who'd been exposed to the West, even if that exposure came from fighting Germans. Soldiers who'd been POWs were viewed with suspicion, sent to labor camps, or executed as potential traitors. The men who'd fought bravely, who'd held impossible positions and delayed German advances at the cost of their own lives, were often rewarded with surveillance and suspicion. It was a bitter homecoming for heroes who'd saved their country. Lieutenant Weber, meanwhile, returned to a Germany that no longer existed. The Third Reich had collapsed, its cities bombed into rubble, its population traumatized by years of war and the revelations of the Holocaust. He'd fought for a regime that had committed atrocities beyond imagination, and there was no escaping that complicity. Some veterans claimed they didn't know, that they were just soldiers following orders. Weber never made that excuse. He'd seen the SS units operating behind the lines, had heard the stories from other soldiers. He'd known, everyone had known. The guilt of that knowledge was a weight he carried for the rest of his life. But he also remembered the KV-1 at Raseiniai and the lesson it had taught him, that wars weren't won by superior ideology or racial purity or any of the other lies the Nazis had sold to the German people. Wars were won by nations that could build enough tanks, train enough soldiers, and absorb enough punishment to keep fighting when everyone else had quit. The Soviet Union had done that. Germany hadn't. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and undeniable. The Cold War transformed the KV-1 from a weapon into a symbol. Soviet propaganda celebrated the tank as evidence of socialist industrial superiority, proof that the workers' state could outproduce and outfight capitalist nations. The Americans, busy building their own arsenal of tanks and atomic weapons, studied Soviet armor doctrine and adapted their own designs accordingly. The M-26 Pershing, introduced near the end of World War II, was America's answer to the Tiger and KV-1, a heavy tank that could trade blows with anything the Soviets or Germans could field. The KV-1 itself became obsolete, replaced by more modern designs, but examples survived in museums and military collections around the world. Walking around one of these preserved tanks, you could see the impact scars on the armor, evidence of battles fought decades ago. You could climb inside and feel the cramped interior, imagine what it was like to crew this vehicle under fire, knowing that German tanks were hunting you, and that your survival depended on armor plate and the skill of your driver. The veterans aged, as veterans do. Weber lived into his 80s, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunify. He gave occasional interviews, usually to historians researching the Eastern Front, and always told the same story about Raseiniai, the KV-1 that wouldn't die. The moment he realized that Germany had underestimated the Soviet Union in ways that would prove fatal. He never glorified war, never claimed that his service had been honorable or justified. He'd fought for an evil regime, and knowing that it was evil didn't absolve him of responsibility. The Soviet tankers, those who survived, had their own reckonings. Some embraced the Soviet system, became party members, believed in the socialist future they'd fought to defend. Others grew disillusioned, recognizing that Stalin's regime was almost as brutal as Hitler's, just more efficient at hiding its crimes. But they'd stopped the Wehrmacht, and that mattered. They'd saved Russia from destruction, even if the Russia they'd saved wasn't quite what they'd hoped it would be. Modern military historians study the KV-1 as an example of effective wartime design. It wasn't the best tank of World War II by any individual metric. The German Panthers had better guns and more sophisticated fire control. The American Shermans were more reliable and easier to maintain. But the KV-1 was good enough, and it was available in quantity, and those two factors made it strategically decisive. The perfect tank that arrives too late to matter is less valuable than the adequate tank that's already on the battlefield. The lessons of the KV-1 extended beyond tank design. The Soviet ability to move entire factories out of German reach, to maintain production under impossible circumstances, to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting, these were strategic capabilities that shaped the outcome of the war. Germany's military was tactically superior in many ways, but tactics matter less when the enemy can replace their losses and you can't. The Eastern Front was decided by industrial capacity and national will, and the Soviets had both in abundance. The human cost of that victory is harder to quantify. Every KV-1 represented thousands of hours of labor by factory workers, many of them women and teenagers who'd taken the place of men, conscripted into the Red Army. Every tank destroyed meant a crew killed or wounded, men who'd trained for months to operate a complex piece of machinery and died in seconds when an 80mm shell penetrated their armor. The numbers were staggering. The Soviets lost approximately 96,500 tanks during World War II, more than Germany produced during the entire war. Behind each number was a story, a crew, a moment of terror and violence that that ended with fire and death. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The KV-1 at Raseiniai wasn't unique in its defiance, just uniquely documented. All across the Eastern Front, Soviet tankers fought similar battles, holding positions they knew were doomed, buying time for retreating infantry or defending roadblocks that the Germans needed to capture. These small actions, multiplied across thousands of engagements, added up to strategic significance. The Wehrmacht's timetable for Operation Barbarossa assumed rapid Soviet collapse. The KV-1s and T-34s, crewed by men who refused to collapse, turned assumptions into casualties. The psychological dimension of armored warfare is often overlooked in discussions of technical specifications. A Panzer III crew that had dominated European battlefields suddenly facing a tank they couldn't hurt experienced a kind of existential terror that no amount of training could prepare them for. The confidence that came from technological superiority evaporated, replaced by the knowledge that survival was no longer guaranteed. This wasn't just about kill ratios or armor thickness, it was about morale, about the willingness to close with an enemy who could kill you before you could kill them. Soviet doctrine emphasized aggressive action, even when outmatched. A KV-1 crew ordered to hold a position would do exactly that, fighting until their ammunition was gone or their tank was destroyed. This wasn't fanaticism in the Nazi sense, ideological purity overriding self-preservation. It was a calculated understanding that retreating meant Germany would push deeper into Russia, would reach Moscow and Leningrad, would succeed in their goal of destroying the Soviet Union. The tankers at Raseiniai weren't trying to be heroes. They were trying to survive a war that threatened their entire civilization. And if dying in a tank delayed the Germans for a few hours, that was a trade worth making. The Germans, for their part, developed a grudging respect for Soviet armor crews. The propaganda back home portrayed the Soviets as subhuman, racially inferior, incapable of sophisticated military operations. The reality on the ground was different. Soviet tankers were skilled, brave, and increasingly experienced. They learned from their mistakes, adapted their tactics, exploited German weaknesses. By 1943, the Red Army's armored forces were conducting operations of a complexity and scale that rivaled anything the Germans could manage, and they were doing it with better equipment and more of it. The production of Soviet armor was itself a kind of miracle. The factories that built KV-1s operated under conditions that would be considered impossible in peacetime. Workers labored 12-hour shifts, often longer. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Heating was minimal, even in the brutal Russian winter. German bombers targeted these facilities constantly, and anti-aircraft defenses were primitive at best. Yet production continued, even increased. The Soviet people understood what was at stake. This wasn't a war for territory or resources, it was a war for existence. If Germany won, the Slavic peoples would be enslaved or exterminated. That knowledge focused minds wonderfully. American and British observers who visited Soviet tank factories during the war came away impressed and disturbed. The efficiency was remarkable, the dedication unquestionable, but the human cost was staggering. Workers died from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from industrial accidents that were inevitable given the pace and pressure of wartime production. The Soviet Union was eating itself to defeat Germany, consuming its own population in a desperate bid for survival. It worked, but the price was almost unbearable. The strategic bombing campaign that Germany conducted against Soviet industry was less effective than Hitler hoped. The factories were dispersed, hidden, moved when threatened. Soviet air defenses, while primitive compared to German or Allied systems, were adequate to force bombers to attack from high altitude, reducing accuracy. And even when a factory was hit, the Soviets proved remarkably resilient at repairing damage and resuming production. Germany was learning the same lesson the British had taught them during the Blitz. Industrial nations with motivated populations are very hard to bomb into submission. The KV-1's mechanical unreliability, often cited as a weakness, was actually a strategic choice. Soviet engineers could have designed a more reliable tank, but it would have required better materials, more precise manufacturing, and longer production times. The Soviets chose quantity over refinement, betting that having 3 KV-1s that broke down occasionally was better than having one perfectly reliable tank. History proved them right. The tanks that broke down could be repaired, the factories that were destroyed could be rebuilt. But time lost to slow production could never be recovered, and in 1941, time was the resource the Soviet Union needed most desperately. German tankers developed techniques for dealing with KV-1s that emphasized teamwork and combined arms. A single panzer trying to engage a KV-1 frontally was suicide, but panzers working together, maneuvering to get side shots while infantry pinned the Soviet tank with small arms fire, could succeed. Artillery could damage tracks or optics, mission-killing a tank without destroying it. The 80mm guns, positioned in ambush, could kill KV-1s at range before the Soviet crews even knew they were under fire. These tactics worked, but they required coordination, communication, and resources that the German military increasingly lacked as the war ground on. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder for both sides, but the mathematics favored the Soviets. Germany had a population of about 70 million, and while they could draw on resources from occupied territories, the industrial base was fundamentally limited. The Soviet Union had a population of 196 million, vast natural resources, and an industrial capacity that, once mobilized, dwarfed anything Germany could produce. Every German tank destroyed was difficult to replace. Every Soviet tank destroyed was replaced within weeks, sometimes days. The attrition affected morale differently on each side. German soldiers, told they were fighting for civilization against Asiatic hordes, increasingly realized they were fighting a nation that was outproducing, outfighting, and outlasting them. The propaganda about racial superiority rang hollow when Soviet tanks were superior to German ones, and Soviet factories were producing them faster than Germany could destroy them. Desperation crept in, the understanding that this war, which was supposed to be over in months, was going to continue indefinitely and probably end in defeat. Soviet morale had its own complexities. The initial shock of Barbarossa, the catastrophic losses of 1941, had given way to grim determination by 1942. The people knew what the Germans had done in occupied territories. They'd heard the stories of mass executions, forced labor, deliberate starvation. There was no illusion that surrender was an option. This was existential warfare, and the only possible outcome was complete victory or utter destruction. That clarity, terrible as it was, unified the Soviet population in ways that Hitler's ideology never unified Germany. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The KV-1's combat record was impressive but not unblemished. Soviet tankers discovered that the vehicle's weight made it vulnerable to soft ground, a serious problem on the Eastern Front where paved roads were rare and mud was a constant enemy. The transmission, overworked by the tank's mass, failed with depressing regularity. The 76mm gun, while powerful, had limited ammunition stowage, forcing crews to be selective about their targets. These weren't fatal flaws, but they required adaptations, learning from experience rather than training. Soviet training for tank crews was abbreviated out of necessity. The Red Army was losing experienced tankers faster than they could train replacements, so training periods were compressed, corners were cut, and crews were sent into combat with minimal preparation. This resulted in higher initial casualties, but the survivors learned quickly, and by 1943, the average Soviet tank crew was as skilled as their German counterparts. They'd learned in the harshest school imaginable, where mistakes meant death and excellence meant survival. The relationship between Soviet tank crews and their German opponents was complex. They were trying to kill each other, certainly, and both sides committed atrocities that stained whatever honor might have existed in combat. But there was also a mutual recognition of shared experience. Both German and Soviet tankers understood the unique terror of armored warfare, the vulnerability of being locked inside a metal box that could become a crematorium in seconds. They understood the loyalty to crew, the bonds that formed between men who depended on each other for survival. These commonalities didn't create friendship or compassion during combat, but they did create a kind of respect. The Soviet practice of naming tanks after fallen crews or heroes was both inspirational and devastating. A KV-1 might carry the names of a dozen different crews, each one lost in combat, each one replaced by new tankers who knew they might be adding their own names to the list soon. It was a constant reminder of mortality, of the price being paid, but it also created continuity, a sense that the struggle was larger than any individual. The tank fought on, even when the men inside it died. German prisoners who'd faced KV-1s in combat often expressed astonishment at the conditions Soviet tankers endured. The cold in winter was so extreme that diesel fuel gelled, and engines wouldn't start without fires being lit underneath them, a process that took hours and was dangerous in the extreme. Summer brought its own miseries. heat exhaustion, inadequate water supplies, and the constant threat of breakdown in hostile territory. That Soviet tankers continued to fight effectively under these conditions was a testament to their toughness and determination. The logistics of supporting KV-1 units were nightmarish. The tanks consumed fuel at prodigious rates, required constant maintenance, and needed ammunition resupply after even brief engagements. Soviet logistics were always strained, operating on minimal infrastructure with constant German interdiction. That they managed to keep armored units supplied and operational was itself a minor miracle, achieved through improvisation, sacrifice, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept failure. The evolution of German anti-tank weapons was driven largely by the KV-1 and T-34. The Panzerfaust, a disposable rocket launcher that could be carried by a single soldier, gave German infantry a fighting chance against Soviet armor. The Panzerschreck, a reusable launcher based on the American bazooka, was effective but heavy and required a two-man crew. These weapons leveled the playing field somewhat, but they required infantry to get close to Soviet tanks, a prospect that terrified even veteran soldiers. Soviet tankers learned to work closely with their own infantry, using them to screen against German anti-tank teams, creating a combined arms approach that was devastatingly effective. The impact of the KV-1 on post-war tank design was subtle but significant. The Soviets continued their emphasis on heavy armor and big guns, leading to the IS series and eventually to Cold War monsters like the T-10. The Americans, learning from both German and Soviet designs, developed the M26 Pershing and later the M48 Patton, balancing firepower, protection, and mobility in ways that reflected lessons learned on the Eastern Front. The British, always innovative, experimented with various designs before settling on the Centurion, a medium tank that could perform the role of a heavy tank through superior design rather than sheer mass. The veterans of Raseiniai, both German and Soviet, were bound by a shared experience that transcended nationality or ideology. They'd participated in a moment of historical significance, when one tank had embodied everything the Soviet Union would become: tough, resilient, willing to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The Germans who'd tried to destroy it understood what it represented. The Soviets who'd crewed it knew what they'd achieved, and both sides carried those memories for the rest of their lives, a reminder that wars are fought by humans who bleed and die and remember. The preservation of KV-1 tanks in museums worldwide serves a purpose beyond mere historical curiosity. These are tangible connections to a conflict that shaped the modern world, reminders of what industrial warfare looks like when nations commit everything to victory. Walking around a preserved KV-1, you can touch the armor that stopped German shells, see the gun that killed panzers, imagine the men who fought and died inside. It's a sobering experience, a confrontation with history that no amount of reading can replicate. The final accounting of the KV-1's contribution to Soviet victory is impossible to calculate precisely. How many German tanks did it destroy? How many advances did it delay? How much time did it buy for Soviet industry to evacuate and rebuild? The numbers exist, but they're incomplete, flawed, dependent on records that were often lost or never made. What's undeniable is that the KV-1, along with the T-34, gave the Soviet Union a fighting chance when Germany expected easy victory. That alone justifies its place in history. The men who designed the KV-1 worked in obscurity, their names known only to specialists and historians. Soviet culture didn't celebrate individual engineers the way Western nations did. The glory belonged to the collective, to the Soviet people as a unified whole. But those designers saved their country as surely as any soldier. They understood what was coming, understood that Germany would bring tanks and guns and a philosophy of annihilation, and they built something that could fight back. The KV-1 was their answer to fascism, delivered in armor plate and high-explosive shells. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The broader context of the Eastern Front makes the KV-1's achievements even more remarkable. This wasn't warfare as the West understood it, with relatively humane treatment of prisoners and some attempt to follow international conventions. This was existential struggle, where both sides understood that defeat meant the destruction of their way of life. German soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew their country faced total defeat. Soviet soldiers fought with the knowledge that their families faced extermination if they lost. The KV-1 was a weapon in that struggle, but it was also a symbol of Soviet determination to survive. The industrial competition between Germany and the Soviet Union revealed fundamental differences in how each nation approached warfare, Germany, with its tradition of precision engineering and artisan craftsmanship, built tanks that were technological marvels but difficult and slow to produce. The Soviet Union, with its emphasis on mass production and practical design, built tanks that were adequate rather than perfect, but available in overwhelming numbers. History demonstrated that adequate in quantity beats perfect in scarcity, a lesson that military planners still study today. The human dimension of the KV-1's story is what resonates across decades. The crews who fought in these tanks weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, doing their best to survive and complete their missions. They experienced fear, exhaustion, moments of courage, instances of failure. They formed bonds with their crews that lasted lifetimes for those who survived. They watched friends die, saw cities burn, participated in a war that killed millions and changed history. The KV-1 was their tool, their protection, their weapon. It kept them alive when nothing else could. The German reaction to Soviet armor evolved throughout the war, from dismissive confidence to shocked respect to desperate innovation. The early days of Barbarossa, when panzer units expected easy victories, gave way to the grinding reality of facing an enemy who wouldn't quit. German tankers learned to fear the sound of a KV-1's engine, the distinctive rumble that announced trouble. They developed tactics, techniques, and weapons to counter Soviet armor, but they never regained the easy superiority they'd enjoyed in Poland and France. The Eastern Front was where German confidence went to die, killed by Soviet steel and determination. The post-war Soviet Union celebrated its victory with monuments and memorials, parades, and propaganda. The KV-1 featured prominently in these celebrations, a symbol of Soviet industrial and military strength. But the veterans who'd actually fought in these tanks often had more complicated feelings. They'd won, yes, but the cost had been staggering. Entire generations of young men were gone. Cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. Victory felt less like triumph and more like survival, and the difference mattered. The legacy of the KV-1 extends beyond military history into the realm of national identity. For Russia, the tank represents a moment when their country stood against what seemed like inevitable defeat and won. It's a source of pride, a reminder that Russia can defend itself against any threat. For Germany, it represents the moment when assumptions about racial superiority and military invincibility were shattered by reality. These competing narratives shape how both nations understand World War II and their roles in it. Modern tank design owes a debt to the KV-1 that's not always acknowledged. The emphasis on heavy armor and powerful guns, the willingness to sacrifice mobility for protection, the understanding that crew survival is paramount, these principles were demonstrated by the KV-1 and refined by subsequent generations of tanks. The M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, the Challenger, these modern main battle tanks are the descendants of the KV-1, incorporating lessons learned on the Eastern Front and applying them with contemporary technology. The story of the KV-1 at Raseiniai is ultimately about more than a single tank or a single battle. It's about the nature of modern warfare, where industrial capacity and national will matter more than tactical brilliance or individual heroism. It's about the men who fought and died in machines they barely understood, following orders they sometimes questioned, serving countries that didn't always value their sacrifice. It's about the moment when Germany realized that conquering the Soviet Union would be far harder than they'd imagined, and the moment when the Soviets realized they could win. Lieutenant Weber died in 2005, taking his memories of Raseiniai with him. Before he passed, he gave one final interview, his voice weak but clear, talking about the KV-1 that had stopped his unit all those years ago. He didn't glorify the experience or claim it had taught him profound lessons. He simply stated the facts. One Soviet tank, 5 men, had held off an entire German division for hours. It shouldn't have been possible, but it happened. And in happening, it changed everything. The Soviet tankers who crewed that KV-1, assuming they survived the war, returned to a country that had been devastated beyond recognition. 27 million dead, cities reduced to rubble, families destroyed. They'd won, but victory looked a lot like defeat from ground level. Still, they'd stopped the Wehrmacht. They'd held the line when holding seemed impossible. That mattered. That would always matter. The KV-1 sits in museums now, quiet and still, its armor scarred by battles fought 8 decades ago. Children climb on it, take pictures, ask their parents what it was like. Veterans who served in later conflicts look at it with professional interest, evaluating its design with the benefit of hindsight. But for those who were there, who fought in or against these tanks. The KV-1 represents something more fundamental. It represents the moment when the Wehrmacht's advance faltered, when Soviet resistance stiffened, when the outcome of the war in the East became uncertain. One tank, one crew, one impossible stand. That's where the tide turned. That's where history changed. And if you walk around a preserved KV-1 today, really look at it, you can see why the Germans refused to believe it was real. 52 tons of steel, shaped with brutal efficiency into a weapon that redefined armored warfare. The kind of vehicle that shouldn't exist but did, built by a nation that wasn't supposed to survive but would. The scars on its armor tell stories of battles fought and won, of shells that hit and failed to penetrate, of a crew that refused to surrender until they had no choice. It's a monument to human determination, Soviet engineering, and the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare. One tank that stopped a division. One crew that changed history. One moment when everything the Germans believed was proven wrong. That's the legacy of the KV-1. That's the story that needs to be remembered. The broader implications of the KV-1's existence extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation at Raseiniai. German intelligence had failed catastrophically, and that failure rippled through every level of Wehrmacht planning. The entire strategy for Barbarossa was predicated on assumptions about Soviet military capability that the KV-1 and T-34 proved false within days of the invasion. Hitler's timetable for conquering the Soviet Union before winter gave no allowance for encountering armor that could match or exceed German tanks. The logistics trains were designed to support a rapid advance against light opposition, not a grinding battle against an enemy with superior equipment. Field Marshal von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, received reports about the KV-1 encounters with visible frustration. His panzer divisions were supposed to be racing toward Moscow, encircling Soviet armies, creating the conditions for a quick victory. Instead, they were getting bogged down in local actions against individual Soviet tanks that required specialized weapons to defeat. The delays were measured in hours and days, but those hours and days accumulated. The margins that separated success from failure in Operation Barbarossa were razor-thin, and every delay pushed the invasion closer to the Russian winter that would ultimately doom it. The Soviet High Command, observing the German reaction to their heavy armor, drew their own conclusions. The KV-1 and T-34 gave them a foundation to build on, proof that Soviet design philosophy could compete with and exceed Western standards. But they also recognized the vulnerabilities. The KV-1 was too heavy, too slow, too mechanically unreliable for the kind of mobile warfare the modern battlefield demanded. The lessons learned from 1941 and 1942 would inform the next generation of Soviet armor, leading to the IS series heavy tanks and improved variants of the T-34 that addressed early weaknesses. The human cost of these lessons was paid by tankers who discovered design flaws in combat, where failure meant death. Soviet crews reported that the KV-1's weight made it prone to throwing tracks on rough terrain, a problem that left them immobilized and vulnerable. The limited visibility from inside the tank meant that crews often didn't see threats until too late. The ammunition stowage, while adequate for most engagements, ran dry during prolonged battles, forcing tankers to abandon perfectly functional vehicles because they had no shells left to fire. These reports filtered back to the design bureaus, where engineers worked to address the problems while maintaining production rates. The relationship between Soviet tankers and the engineers who designed their vehicles was complex and often contentious. Crews felt, sometimes justifiably, that designers prioritized paper specifications over practical usability. The ergonomics inside a KV-1 were terrible, with controls positioned in ways that seemed almost deliberately inconvenient. Loading the main gun required the loader to perform a series of movements that were awkward in the confined space and nearly impossible when the tank was moving over rough ground. The designers, for their part, were working under constraints that crews rarely appreciated: material shortages, production quotas, and political pressure to deliver results immediately. German responses to Soviet armor continued to evolve throughout 1942 and into 1943. The appearance of the Tiger the Wine in late 1942 was a direct response to the KV-1, a vehicle designed specifically to dominate Soviet heavy tanks. With an 82mm gun that could penetrate any Soviet armor at combat ranges and frontal armor thick enough to resist most Soviet anti-tank weapons, the Tiger represented German engineering at its finest. It was also expensive, complex, and produced in numbers that were wholly inadequate for the scale of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union could afford to lose 3 T-34s to destroy one Tiger and still come out ahead. Germany couldn't afford to lose Tigers at all. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the evolution of both German and Soviet armor doctrine. The Germans assembled the largest concentration of armor in history, including hundreds of Tigers and the new Panther medium tanks for Operation Citadel. The Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, prepared a defense in depth with thousands of anti-tank guns, artillery, and their own armor, including improved KV-85s and T-34s equipped with the more powerful 85mm gun. The battle became a test of industrial capacity as much as tactical skill. Germany lost approximately 760 tanks and assault guns. The Soviet Union lost around 1,600 tanks, but could replace them. Germany couldn't. Kursk was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, and after it, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. The KV-1's role at Kursk was limited, as the KV-85 had largely replaced it by mid-1943, but the principles it embodied remained central to Soviet armor doctrine. Heavy armor to protect the crew, powerful gun to kill enemy tanks, simple design to enable mass production. These weren't revolutionary concepts, but the Soviets implemented them with a ruthlessness that Western nations couldn't match. Soviet factories didn't have the luxury of endless revisions and improvements. They built what worked, built it in quantity, and accepted that some percentage would fail in ways that killed their crews. It was brutal calculus, but it was effective. The experience of crewing a KV-1 varied depending on when and where you served. In 1941, you were often part of a desperate defense, throwing your tank into battle against overwhelming odds, buying time for units behind you to retreat or reorganize. By 1942, you might be part of a counteroffensive, using your armor advantage to lead attacks against German positions that had been weakened by months of attrition. By 1943, you were probably being transitioned to a newer vehicle, the KV-85 or IS-2, as the Red Army modernized its heavy tank forces. Each phase had its own challenges, its own terrors, its own cost in blood. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Soviet tanker training evolved as the war progressed. In 1941, training was minimal, sometimes consisting of just a few days familiarizing crews with their vehicles before they were sent to the front. This resulted in predictably high casualties as inexperienced crews made mistakes that veterans would have avoided. By 1943, the Soviets had established more comprehensive training programs, though they remained shorter and less detailed than German or American equivalents. The difference was that Soviet crews learned in a combat environment that rewarded quick learning and punished mistakes instantly. The survivors became very good very fast. The role of women in Soviet armored forces deserves mention. While women didn't typically serve as tank crew in KV-1s, they were heavily represented in support roles: mechanics, ammunition handlers, logistics specialists. Some women served as tank commanders in lighter vehicles, and all faced the same dangers and hardships as their male counterparts. The Soviet Union was more willing than Western nations to utilize women in combat roles, driven by desperate necessity, rather than progressive ideology. The women who served proved themselves capable, and their contributions were essential to Soviet victory. The maintenance burden of keeping KV-1s operational in field conditions was staggering. The tank required regular attention to tracks, suspension, engine, transmission, and gun systems. Spare parts were chronically short, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged vehicles to keep operational ones running. Field repairs were conducted in conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. Extreme cold that made metal brittle, mud that made movement almost impossible, constant threat of German air attack or artillery bombardment. That Soviet maintenance crews managed to keep their armor running under these circumstances was testament to their skill and determination. German tankers captured during the war often expressed surprise at the conditions Soviet tankers operated under. The Germans were accustomed to relatively reliable logistics, adequate spare parts, and maintenance facilities that, while strained, were functional. The Soviets operated with minimal support, often fabricating parts in the field from scavenged materials, going days without hot food or adequate sleep. The contrast revealed different national philosophies about what soldiers should endure. The Germans tried to maintain some level of normal military life even in combat. The Soviets accepted that war meant suffering and focused on winning rather than comfort. The propaganda value of the KV-1 was exploited by both sides in different ways. Soviet propaganda emphasized the tank as proof of socialist industrial superiority, evidence that the workers' state could produce weapons that exceeded capitalist designs. German propaganda, after the initial shock, focused on the heroism of German soldiers who fought against overwhelming odds, framing the KV-1 as a challenge that German courage would overcome. Both narratives served their purposes, shaping civilian understanding of the war in ways that supported continued sacrifice. The actual experience of combat in a KV-1 was difficult to communicate to civilians who had never been under fire. The noise inside the tank was overwhelming. The engine, the tracks, the gun, the impact of enemy shells on armor, all combined into a cacophony that made communication difficult even with internal radios. The heat in summer could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit inside the crew compartment, while winter temperatures could freeze any exposed metal to skin on contact. The smell of cordite, diesel fuel, sweat, and fear created an atmosphere that tankers never forgot. The psychological impact of being immobilized in a KV-1 was particularly severe. The tank's armor provided excellent protection, but if the tracks were damaged or the engine failed, the crew was trapped. German doctrine called for bypassing immobilized Soviet tanks and letting follow-on infantry deal with them, but that knowledge didn't make the experience less terrifying. Crews in disabled KV-1s would fight as long as ammunition lasted, knowing that surrender might not be accepted, and that German infantry had access to weapons that could penetrate even their heavy armor at close range. The stories of individual KV-1 crews are mostly lost to history, buried in archives or never recorded at all. The Soviet system didn't emphasize individual achievement. Medals were awarded, but often posthumously, and the focus was always on collective victory rather than personal heroism. But the crews existed, men with names and families and lives that ended in burning tanks on battlefields whose names are now forgotten. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics or propaganda, but as individuals who faced impossible choices and did their best to survive and fight. The German military's respect for Soviet armor was grudging, but genuine. Officers who had dismissed the Red Army as incompetent before Barbarossa learned to take Soviet forces seriously, to plan carefully, to avoid the kind of mistakes that got units destroyed. The Tiger and Panther tanks that Germany produced in response to the KV-1 and T-34 were excellent vehicles, arguably superior in many ways to their Soviet counterparts. But they came too late, and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. Germany had lost the industrial competition before it began, and all the tactical brilliance in the world couldn't compensate for being outnumbered and outproduced. The post-war fate of surviving KV-1s varied. Some were scrapped for metal, melted down to help rebuild a shattered Soviet economy. Others were used for training, allowing new generations of tankers to learn on vehicles that were obsolete but still functional. A few were preserved as monuments, placed in city squares or outside military bases as reminders of the victory over fascism. These preserved tanks became pilgrimage sites for veterans who'd fought in or against them, places where old men could stand and remember friends lost decades ago. The Cold War transformed how both sides viewed their World War II armor. The Soviets continued to emphasize heavy, well-armored tanks, leading to vehicles like the T-10 heavy tank and eventually the T-72 and T-80 main battle tanks. The Americans, learning from both German and Soviet designs, developed their own doctrine emphasizing mobility, firepower, and crew protection in roughly equal measure. The M60 and later the M1 Abrams represented American attempts to synthesize lessons from the Eastern Front with their own military culture and industrial capabilities. The crews who fought in KV-1s and survived to see the Cold War had complicated feelings about the arms race between East and West. They'd fought to save their country from destruction, had watched friends die, had survived horrors that peacetime citizens couldn't imagine. Now their governments were building even more terrible weapons, preparing for wars that could end civilization. Some veterans became peace activists, speaking out against the nuclear arms race. Others remained loyal to the Soviet system, believing that strength was the only guarantee of security. Most just tried to live their lives, haunted by memories they couldn't escape and didn't want to share. The technical specifications of the KV-1 tell only part of its story. Yes, it had 76 mm frontal armor angled at 30 degrees. Yes, it's 76. 2 mm gun could penetrate 69 mm of armor at 1,000 meters. Yes, it weighed 47 metric tons and had a top speed of 35 kilometers per hour. These numbers are important for understanding the vehicle's capabilities, but they don't capture what it meant to crew one, to maintain one, to fight against one. The human dimension of armored warfare is always more complex than the statistics suggest. The KV-1's influence on subsequent Soviet tank design was both direct and subtle. The IS-2, which began replacing the KV series in 1943, incorporated many lessons learned from the KV-1's combat experience. Thicker armor, angled more effectively to maximize protection. A more powerful 122mm gun that could destroy any German tank. Improved mechanical reliability through better engineering and quality control. The IS-2 was essentially a perfected KV-1, benefiting from years of combat feedback and evolutionary design improvements. The German response to Soviet heavy tanks created a technological arms race that consumed resources both sides could ill afford. Every improvement in Soviet armor thickness prompted German development of more powerful guns. Every increase in German gun performance led to thicker Soviet armor. The cycle accelerated throughout the war, producing vehicles like the King Tiger with armor so thick that few weapons could penetrate it but so heavy that it could barely move. The law of diminishing returns applied to tank design just as it did to everything else, but neither side could afford to let the other gain an advantage. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The strategic bombing of Soviet tank factories by the Luftwaffe was less successful than Germany hoped, but it did have an impact. The factory that produced the KV-1's engines was hit multiple times, forcing production slowdowns and temporary shifts to alternate engine types. These disruptions rippled through the entire production system, causing delays and forcing tank units to wait for vehicles that should have been delivered weeks earlier. Soviet adaptability in the face of these disruptions was remarkable, but the cost in lost production was significant. The winterization of the KV-1 for operations in extreme cold revealed both Soviet foresight and the brutal reality of the Eastern Front climate. Special lubricants that remained fluid at temperatures that would freeze standard oils. Heaters for crew compartments that drew power from the engine. Engine preheaters that could be fueled externally to warm the engine before attempting to start it in sub-zero temperatures. These modifications were developed through experience, often through catastrophic failures that left crews stranded in hostile territory with inoperable vehicles. German tankers learned to avoid engaging KV-1s frontally unless absolutely necessary, preferring to maneuver for side shots or wait for infantry to bring up heavier weapons. This cautious approach was sensible but time-consuming, exactly the kind of delay that Soviet doctrine aimed to create. Every hour spent maneuvering around a KV-1 was an hour that German units weren't advancing toward Moscow or Leningrad. These accumulated delays, multiplied across hundreds of engagements, added up to strategic significance. The morale impact of encountering a KV-1 for the first time was devastating to German troops who had been told they were fighting an inferior enemy. The psychological component of warfare is often overlooked, but it mattered enormously on the Eastern Front. German soldiers who had felt invincible after their victories in Poland and France suddenly confronted their own vulnerability. This didn't break German morale immediately, but it planted seeds of doubt that would grow as the war dragged on and casualties mounted. Soviet tanker memoirs, published after the war, provide glimpses into the experience of crewing a KV-1. The constant fear of mechanical breakdown, the relief when a German shell bounced off the armor, the horror of watching friendly tanks burn, the exhaustion that came from days without sleep, fighting continuous engagements with minimal rest or resupply. These accounts are invaluable primary sources, though they must be read carefully, as Soviet censorship often required authors to omit details that contradicted official narratives about the war. The logistics of supplying a KV-1 unit in the field required careful planning and significant resources. The tank consumed fuel at a rate that strained supply lines designed for lighter vehicles. Ammunition, while available, was heavy and bulky, requiring dedicated transport. Spare parts, especially tracks and transmission components, were in constant demand and often in short supply. Soviet logistics officers performed miracles keeping their units supplied, often improvising solutions that would have horrified Western quartermasters, but worked well enough to keep the tanks running. The German practice of recovering and repairing knocked-out Soviet tanks for their own use speaks to both the quality of Soviet design and the desperation of German logistics. Captured KV-1s were evaluated, and some were pressed into service with German units, though this practice was limited by ammunition incompatibility and the difficulty of maintaining vehicles designed around different engineering standards. The Germans learned more from studying captured KV-1s than from using them. applying those lessons to their own tank development programs. The relationship between Soviet tank designers and the political apparatus that controlled them was fraught with danger. Engineers who failed to meet production quotas or whose designs performed poorly in combat could be arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Stalin's paranoia extended to all aspects of Soviet life, and the military-industrial complex was no exception. That Soviet designers managed to produce excellent tanks under these conditions says something about their skill and dedication, though it also reflects the brutal efficiency of a system that tolerated no failure. The experience of being a German tanker facing Soviet armor evolved throughout the war. In 1941, it was shock and surprise. In 1942, respect mixed with determination. By 1943, it was often fear, as German tanks became increasingly outmatched and German crews increasingly aware that they were fighting a losing battle. The psychological toll of knowing that every engagement might be your last, that the enemy had better equipment and more of it, was corrosive. German tankers maintained their professionalism, but the confidence that had characterized the early years of the war was gone. The Soviet practice of concentrating armor for breakthrough operations was enabled by the KV-1 and T-34. These tanks could absorb punishment while leading attacks, creating gaps in German lines that lighter forces could exploit. The heavy tanks would bear the brunt of German defensive fire, using their armor to survive long enough to suppress German anti-tank weapons and create opportunities for exploitation. This doctrine was costly in tanks and lives, but it worked, and by 1944, the Red Army was conducting offensive operations of a scale and complexity that rivaled anything the Germans had achieved during their glory years. The final production run of the KV-1 ended in 1943 as factories transitioned to newer designs. The tank had served its purpose, providing the Red Army with a heavy vehicle capable of matching or exceeding German armor at a critical moment in the war. Its successor, the IS-2, would carry forward the lessons learned, but the KV-1 would always hold a special place in Soviet military history as the tank that stopped the Wehrmacht when stopping seemed impossible. The veterans of the Raseiniai engagement, both German and Soviet, remained in contact after the war, a practice that was unusual but not unheard of among former enemies. They shared a bond forged in combat, a mutual understanding of what they'd experienced that transcended nationality or ideology. These connections were kept quiet during the Cold War, when fraternizing with former enemies was viewed with suspicion by both sides, but they persisted, maintained through carefully worded letters and occasional meetings. The broader lesson of the KV-1 is about the nature of modern warfare and the relationship between technology, industrial capacity, and national will. Germany had excellent technology, skilled soldiers, and brilliant tactics. The Soviet Union had adequate technology, determined soldiers willing to absorb catastrophic losses, and an industrial base that could outproduce Germany in every category. In a total war between industrial nations, the latter combination proved decisive. Quality matters, but quantity has a quality all its own, and the Soviet Union had quantity in overwhelming abundance. The story of the KV-1 at Raseiniai is remembered because it encapsulates so much about the Eastern Front. One tank, 5 men, stopping an entire division. It shouldn't have been possible, but it happened. And in happening, it revealed truths about the war that neither side wanted to acknowledge. For Germany, it showed that their assumptions about Soviet inferiority were dangerously wrong. For the Soviet Union, it demonstrated that their military could match and exceed German capabilities when given the right tools. For both sides, it was a preview of the grinding, attritional warfare that would characterize the Eastern Front for the next 4 years. The KV-1 stands as a testament to what desperate nations can achieve when survival is at stake. It wasn't the most elegant tank of World War II, nor the most reliable, nor the most comfortable to crew, but it was good enough, and it was there when it mattered, and that made all the difference. The men who designed it, built it, and fought in it saved their country as surely as any hero of Soviet propaganda. They deserve to be remembered not just for what they did, but for what they represented. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they had no other choice. That's the true legacy of the KV-1. That's the story we need to keep alive. The technical evolution that followed the KV-1 demonstrated how rapidly armor design advanced during World War II. The KV-85, introduced in 1943, addressed some of the KV-1's limitations with a more powerful 85mm gun and improved turret design, but it was still built on the same basic chassis with the same mechanical issues that had plagued the original. The IS-2, which entered service in 1944, represented a clean sheet redesign that kept the heavy armor philosophy while improving everything else. These evolutionary steps showed the Soviet design process at work: identify problems, solve them quickly, move to production without endless testing cycles that delayed deployment. The human cost of this rapid development cycle was borne by the crews who fought in vehicles that were still being debugged in combat. Early KV-1s had reliability issues that were only discovered and addressed after tanks broke down in battle. Transmission failures that left crews stranded in hostile territory. Track designs that threw off under stress. Gun mechanisms that jammed at critical moments. These failures killed Soviet tankers, but they also provided data that improved subsequent production runs. It was a brutal form of product testing, but it was effective, and in a war for survival, effectiveness mattered more than elegance. The psychological resilience required to crew a KV-1 cannot be overstated. These men knew that every time they buttoned up the tank and moved toward combat, they might not come back. They knew that German 88mm guns could penetrate their armor under the right conditions. They knew that immobilization meant probable death or capture, yet they climbed into their tanks day after day, mission after mission, because that's what the war demanded. This kind of sustained courage, the daily choice to risk everything, is harder to maintain than the momentary heroism of a single desperate action. The relationship between Soviet infantry and armor was complex and often strained. Infantry needed tank support to break through German defenses, but tanks without infantry support were vulnerable to German anti-tank teams. The coordination between the two branches improved over time, but in 1941 and 1942, it was often poor. Infantry would request tank support that never arrived. Tanks would advance without infantry and be destroyed by hidden anti-tank guns. These coordination failures cost lives and battles, but the Soviets learned from their mistakes, developing combined arms tactics that would prove devastatingly effective by 1944. The German experience of facing Soviet armor shaped how they approached defensive warfare on the Eastern Front. When you know the enemy has tanks that can shrug off your standard anti-tank weapons, you dig deeper, prepare more thoroughly, establish multiple layers of defense. German defensive positions evolved to include dedicated anti-tank strongpoints with 80mm guns, minefields designed to channel armor into kill zones, and infantry equipped with close-range anti-tank weapons for final defense. These elaborate defenses worked, often, but they required time and resources to prepare, and the Soviets were increasingly good at identifying and exploiting weaknesses. The myth of German technological superiority, so carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, died hard on the Eastern Front. German soldiers and officers who had internalized the belief that Aryan ingenuity would prevail over Slavic barbarism confronted the reality that Soviet tanks were better than theirs in several key ways. This cognitive dissonance created tension between propaganda and experience that many German veterans never fully resolved. After the war, some fell back on excuses. They were outnumbered, the weather was against them, Hitler's interference prevented victory. Few acknowledged that the Soviets had simply built better tanks and produced them in overwhelming numbers. The preservation of KV-1 tanks in museums worldwide serves an educational purpose beyond simple historical interest. These vehicles are tangible reminders of industrial total war, of what nations commit to when survival is at stake. Modern museum visitors can see the armor thickness, compare it to other tanks of the era, understand viscerally why German 50mm guns were ineffective against it. They can climb inside, feel the cramped interior, imagine what it was like to fight in this machine. This direct physical connection to history is irreplaceable, something no amount of reading or documentary viewing can fully replicate. The archival footage of KV-1s in action, mostly Soviet propaganda films, shows these tanks in idealized conditions, advancing across open terrain, firing their guns, infantry following behind. What the footage doesn't show is the mechanical breakdowns, the logistic struggles, the tanks abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. Propaganda serves its purpose, but it's not history. The real story of the KV-1 is in the after-action reports, the maintenance logs, the casualty lists. It's in the letters that Soviet tankers sent home, when they were allowed to send letters. It's in the memories of German veterans who faced these tanks and learned to fear them. The evolution of anti-tank warfare on the Eastern Front was driven largely by the need to defeat vehicles like the KV-1. The Germans developed better guns, better tactics, better training for their anti-tank crews. The Soviets responded by thickening armor, improving tactics, training their tankers to work more effectively with infantry. This action-reaction cycle accelerated throughout the war, with each side's innovations prompting counter-innovations from the other. By 1945, both sides had developed anti-tank capabilities that would have seemed impossible in 1941. But the fundamental dynamic remained the same: armor trying to protect crews, guns trying to penetrate that protection. The story of the KV-1 is ultimately a story about the nature of modern war. Technology matters, but it's not decisive by itself. Industrial capacity matters, but only if you have the national will to use it. Tactics matter, but they must adapt to technological realities. The KV-1 worked because it balanced these factors effectively. It was good enough technologically to match or exceed German armor. It could be produced in quantity by Soviet industry. It fit Soviet tactical doctrine. And it was crewed by men who were willing to die fighting rather than surrender. That combination proved unbeatable, not because of any single factor, but because all the factors worked together. The final reckoning of the KV-1's place in military history recognizes it as a transitional vehicle, important not for what it was, but for what it represented. It was the bridge between the light, mobile tanks of the 1930s and the heavy, powerful tanks of the late war and Cold War eras. It proved that heavy armor could be effective on the modern battlefield, that crew protection was worth sacrificing some mobility for. These lessons shaped tank design for decades after World War II, influencing everything from the American M103 heavy tank to the Soviet T-10 and beyond. The men who fought in and against the KV-1 are mostly gone now, their experiences fading into history as the last witnesses pass away. Their legacy lives on in the tanks preserved in museums, in the documents stored in archives, in the stories passed down through families. But most importantly, it lives on in the understanding that wars are fought and won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, by nations that refuse to quit even when defeat seems inevitable, by the stubborn human refusal to accept extinction. The KV-1 embodied that refusal. It was a declaration that the Soviet Union would fight, would resist, would survive. And it did. That's the story. That's what we remember. That's why it matters, even now, 80 years after a single Soviet tank sat on a Lithuanian road and stopped the Wehrmacht in its tracks.